The narrative says pluck and courage. The reality was Turing and Enigma. Britain didn't quit because they were reading Hitler's mail. We show what the U.S. generals didn't know when they arrived. History has long painted a romanticized portrait of a stubborn island nation surviving on grit and defiance alone, a solitary candle flickering against the Nazi hurricane. But while the courage was real, it was bolstered by a secret so profound that its revelation changes the entire calculus of the war's early years, transforming a story of desperate gambling into one of calculated, razor-thin, strategic mastery. London, June 1942. Major General Dwight Eisenhower stepped off the train at Paddington Station and walked straight into a scene that looked less like a capital city and more like a graveyard of empire. The station's great glass roof was shattered, the gaping wounds in the ceiling patched with flapping tarpaulins that did little to hold back the gray English rain. Outside, entire city blocks had been reduced to jagged piles of brick and weed, the architectural skeletons of a metropolis that had been used for artillery practice by the Luftwaffe for 2 years. A red double-decker bus, that universal symbol of London life, rolled past him, but its windows were gone, replaced by rough plywood boards to keep out the blast debris. The people on the sidewalk moved with a grim, hurried purpose, their bodies lean from years of rationing, dressed in coats that had been mended and turned so many times the fabric was beginning to fail. They glanced at Eisenhower's crisp, perfectly tailored American uniform, with eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and a deep, fatalistic exhaustion. They had seen too much death to be easily impressed by the stars on a general's shoulder. Eisenhower had come to take command of American forces in Europe, to build the great alliance that would eventually storm Hitler's fortress Europe. He had read the intelligence reports in Washington, he had studied the maps, and he had memorized the statistics of tonnage and loss. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the visceral, physical reality of a nation that had been fighting the most powerful military machine on earth, alone, for 24 months. Every building told a story of violence. Every face carried the weight of sleepless nights spent in coal cellars, listening to the whistle of falling ordnance. This was not the Britain of American imagination, the land of pomp, ceremony, and imperial arrogance. This was something harder, something forged in fire that refused to break. Eisenhower would later write that he had expected to find a country on the verge of total collapse, a people weary and desperate for American rescue. Instead, he found a population that had looked into the abyss, saw the monsters staring back, and decided to spit in their eyes. But what Eisenhower did not yet fully grasp, what he was only just beginning to be initiated into by a delighted Winston Churchill, was that this refusal to break was not merely a product of national character. It was fueled by the most closely guarded secret of the 20th century. 2 years earlier, in June 1940, Britain had faced the most desperate moment in its 1,000-year history. France had fallen in just 6 weeks, a collapse so rapid and total it stunned the world. The British Expeditionary Force had been miraculously evacuated from Dunkirk, but they had left their teeth on the beaches of France. Thousands of tons of ammunition, nearly 1,000 field guns, and all the Army's heavy tanks and transport vehicles were abandoned. The British Army was a force of men with rifles, lacking the heavy metal required to fight a modern war. The strategic situation was catastrophic. Norway was lost. The Low Countries were lost. The Channel Islands would fall within days. Every major European power except neutral Switzerland and Sweden was now either conquered by Nazi Germany or allied with it. The Soviet Union sat comfortably behind a non-aggression pact with Hitler, carving up Poland. The United States was determinedly neutral, separated by an ocean and a wall of isolationist politics. Britain stood utterly alone against a German war machine that had just demonstrated it could crush the combined armies of Western Europe in 46 days. German generals were already drafting the operational orders for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. They had 4 million men under arms, 3,000 tanks, and complete control of the European coastline from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border. The Luftwaffe possessed over 3,000 modern aircraft, while Britain's Royal Air Force struggled to field fewer than 700 operational fighters. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and unforgiving. In Washington, American military planners looked at the ledger and gave Britain 3 weeks, maybe 6 if they were lucky. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, watching the devastation from London, sent cables back to the State Department arguing that British defeat was inevitable and that America should not tie its future to a sinking ship. Most of the world expected Britain to seek terms. They expected a negotiated peace that would preserve the empire in exchange for recognizing German hegemony over Europe. It was the logical, rational choice for a nation stripped of its allies and its heavy weapons, but the British government did not seek terms. Instead, they prepared to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets. They removed road signs to confuse invaders. They poured concrete pillboxes at rural intersections. They armed the home guard with pikes, shotguns, and Molotov cocktails. Winston Churchill told his cabinet that if the island fell, the government would move to Canada and the Royal Navy would continue the war from the Atlantic. This public narrative of defiance is well known. It is the story of keep calm and carry on. But beneath this surface lay a hidden reality that transformed Churchill's stubbornness from a romantic gesture into a calculated risk. The public thought Britain was fighting blind. They believed their leaders were gazing across the English Channel, guessing at Hitler's intentions, hoping against hope that the invasion barges would not appear out of the mist. The reality was that Winston Churchill was reading Adolf Hitler's mail. Deep in the English countryside at Bletchley Park, a team of mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers had achieved the impossible. They had broken the German Enigma cipher, the complex encryption system used by the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Navy to coordinate their vast forces. The intelligence derived from this source was considered so vital, so sensitive, that it was classified higher than top secret. It was given the designation Ultra. While the American generals arriving in 1942 saw only the external scars of the Blitz, Churchill had spent the previous 2 years making decisions based on this godlike view of the enemy's mind. The fighting blind narrative was a necessary fiction, actively maintained by the Allies to protect the source. If the Germans suspected for a moment that their codes were broken, they would change the settings, and the window into their operations would slam shut, potentially costing millions of lives. So the world saw only the pluck. They did not see the transcripts. This secret knowledge fundamentally alters our understanding of the invasion scare of 1940. During that terrifying summer, the British public and the American observers believed a German landing was imminent. The fear was palpable, but Churchill, armed with Ultra, could see the true state of German preparations. He wasn't guessing. He was reading the Wehrmacht's own logistical reports. Ultra decrypts revealed the German army's limitations, their struggles to amass the necessary shipping, and the chaotic infighting between the German services. This intelligence allowed Churchill to make a strategic gamble that appeared reckless to the outside world, but was actually a calculated employment of superior information. In a move he called Operation Apology, Churchill overrode the advice of his military chiefs and ordered substantial troop convoys, including 3 tank regiments and eventually the entire 2nd Armored Division, to be sent away from the threatened shores of Britain to reinforce operations in the Middle East. At a moment when invasion seemed days away, sending your only heavy armor to Egypt seemed like madness. But Churchill knew what his generals did not. The invasion was not ready. Then, on September 17, 1940, the decisive signal came. An ultra-intercept decoded a Luftwaffe order regarding the dismantling of air-loading equipment at airfields in Belgium. This equipment, specifically designed for paratroops, was being packed up. It was the smoking gun. You do not dismantle your invasion infrastructure if you are about to invade. Churchill knew with absolute certainty that Operation Sea Lion had been cancelled. While the British people continued to scan the horizon with dread, their Prime Minister knew the immediate existential threat had passed. The first true test of this secret advantage came in the skies during the Battle of Britain. Hermann Göring, the flamboyant, commander of the Luftwaffe, believed he could destroy the Royal Air Force in 4 days. He planned to blind Britain's radar network, smash the airfields, and break British morale in 4 weeks. The pilots of RAF Fighter Command were outnumbered 3-1. They were flying Hurricanes and Spitfires in 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties a day, landing only to refuel and rearm before hurling themselves back into the fray. The ground crews worked 18-hour shifts, patching bullet holes and turning aircraft around in minutes. Pilots fell asleep in their cockpits between missions, too exhausted to walk to the mess hall. The attrition was horrifying. Fighter Command lost over 500 pilots killed or wounded between July and October. Entire squadrons were pulled out of the line after losing 3/4 of their strength. New pilots arrived with barely 10 hours of flight training and were often dead within a week. But the RAF had an invisible ace in the hole. The German Luftwaffe's operational communications were riddled with carelessness, and the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, specifically the team in Hut 6, were reading their traffic. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the commander of Fighter Command, was not fighting blind. Ultra-intelligence provided him with a detailed picture of German strategy. He often knew the strength and location of Luftwaffe units before they even took off. While Ultra could not always pinpoint specific targets, it revealed Göring's intentions and the timing of his major assaults. This foreknowledge allowed Dowding to commit his slender resources with surgical precision. He did not have to waste precious fuel and pilot endurance patrolling empty skies. He could hold his squadrons on the ground until the last possible moment, scrambling them to intercept the German raids at the optimal time and altitude. To the German pilots, it seemed as though the RAF was everywhere, that despite being outnumbered, the British always managed to have fighters exactly where they were needed. They attributed this to British radar, which was certainly vital, but the radar was guided by the deep, strategic insight of Ultra. It was a victory of information as much as a victory of aviation. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. Frustrated by the resilience of the RAF, they shifted their sights from the airfields to the City of London itself. They intended to break civilian morale, to terrorize the population into demanding surrender. That first night, 300 bombers dropped 300 tons of high explosive and thousands of incendiary bombs on London's East End. The docks, the commercial heart of the empire, erupted in flames. Warehouses filled with rum, sugar, paint, and timber created firestorms visible 50 miles away. 430 civilians died that night. 1,600 were seriously injured. For 57 consecutive nights, the German bombers returned. The wail of the air, raid siren, became the soundtrack of the evening. Families gathered their children and descended into the underground stations, sleeping on the concrete platforms while the trains rattled past. They hid in basement shelters and coal cellars, listening to the crump of explosions walking across the city map. When the "all clear" sounded at dawn, they emerged into a landscape of gray dust and shattered glass to see if their homes still stood. The bombers did not limit their fury to London. Coventry was hit by 500 bombers in a single night, its medieval city centre pulverized, its cathedral reduced to a hollow, smoking shell. Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, the industrial arteries of the nation were hammered relentlessly. Over 40,000 tons of bombs fell on Britain in 8 months. More than 43,000 civilians were killed. Over 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. And yet the British people did not demand surrender. They developed a grim, stoic routine. They slept in shelters, emerged at dawn, checked for the red flags that marked unexploded bombs, and went to work. Keep calm and carry on was survival, not a slogan. Women took over the factories, driving the cranes and operating the lathes. They staffed the anti-aircraft batteries and plotted the incoming raids on operations room maps. By 1943, over 400,000 women would be serving in uniform. This was the pluck that the American generals would see. But behind the scenes, the terrible burden of the ultra-secret was weighing heavily on Churchill. The myth that he deliberately sacrificed Coventry to protect the secret of Enigma has been largely debunked by historians. The intercepts provided warnings of a major raid, but did not specify the target city until it was too late. However, the principle of pulling a Coventry, of letting events happen rather than risking the source, was a grim reality of the intelligence war. There were times when the Allies had to restrain their reactions, to deliberately hold back attacks on U-boats or allow German units to proceed unmolested simply because acting on the intelligence would have revealed that they were reading the German codes. It was a utilitarian nightmare, sacrificing the few to save the many, protecting the golden goose of Ultra at the cost of blood and iron. This was the shadowy, high-stakes poker game that Britain had been playing alone while America watched from the sidelines. When the Americans finally entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the dynamics of the relationship began to shift. The United States brought industrial might that dwarfed Germany's capabilities. They brought resources that seemed unlimited and an army that would eventually number in the millions. But in 1942, the American military machine was still waking up. The U.S. Army had fewer than 2 million men, many of them poorly trained and equipping themselves with World War I surplus. The integration of the American giant into the sophisticated British intelligence network was not immediate. When the first American generals arrived, they were skeptical. They saw a Britain that had been battered, an army that had been chased out of Europe, and a leadership that seemed to have little to show for 2 years of war but survival. General Mark Clark, who would become a key commander in the Mediterranean, was initially briefed on Ultra by Group Captain Winterbotham. Clark was restless, dismissive. He reportedly found it difficult to believe that such comprehensive intelligence could exist without being compromised. To the Americans, the lack of a decisive British victory suggested weakness, not a carefully managed defense protecting a secret source. This skepticism was a dangerous friction point. The British were holding a royal flush in the form of Ultra, but they had very few chips left on the table. The Americans had all the chips, the tanks, the trucks, the men, but they didn't yet trust the hand their partner was playing. It would take time and the quiet education of men like Eisenhower to bridge this gap. Eisenhower, informed of Ultra in late June 1942, was one of the first converts. He didn't just see the rubble, He began to see the invisible wires that Churchill was pulling. He would later write that Ultra was decisive to the Allied victory, a priceless asset that saved countless lives. But in those early days of the alliance, he had to navigate the tension between American impatience and British caution, a caution born not of timidity, but of the terrifying knowledge of just how close they had come to the edge. As the American buildup in Britain began, the cultural collision was jarring. Over 1.5 million American servicemen would pass through the United Kingdom. They arrived with better pay, better uniforms, and pockets full of nylon stockings and chocolate. Luxuries that had vanished from British life years ago. The resentment was neatly summarized in the famous complaint that the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. But beneath the friction was a grudging, growing respect. The American soldiers saw the reality of the Blitz. They dated British women who had lost husbands in North Africa. They drank in pubs with men who had been evacuated from Dunkirk. They saw a population that was physically smaller, thinner from years of rationing where an adult was allowed 1 fresh egg a week and perhaps 4 ounces of bacon. They saw coats turned inside out to hide the wear, and women drawing lines up the backs of their legs with eyebrow pencil to simulate the seams of stockings they couldn't buy. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, visited Britain in April 1942 and saw this resilience firsthand. He toured the bombed cities and met with British commanders who had been holding the line while America rearmed. He met with Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, a man who had commanded the rearguard at Dunkirk and bore the crushing weight of global strategy. Brooke was brilliant, sharp-tongued, and notoriously impatient with American generals who had never heard a shot fired in anger, yet demanded immediate invasions of occupied Europe. The meeting was cordial on the surface, but tense underneath. Marshall wanted to invade France immediately, in 1942. He looked at the map and saw the shortest distance to Berlin. Brooke looked at the map and saw a death trap. He argued that such an invasion would fail catastrophically, that the Allies were not ready, and that Britain, having bled for 3 years, had earned the right to veto a suicide mission. The compromise was Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. It was a strategy born of necessity, a way to bleed the German army and open the Mediterranean without throwing unprepared American divisions directly into the teeth of the Wehrmacht in France. But the true foundation of the alliance wasn't just built on maps and troop deployments. It was built on the transfer of the most dangerous secret in the world. The Americans needed to be brought into the inner circle of Ultra, but this process was far more complex than simply handing over a key to a safe. It required a fundamental shift in how the United States military understood warfare. Back in January 1941, months before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, a secret 4-man team known as the Sinkoff Mission had arrived at Bletchley Park. Led by Abraham Sinkoff, they came to facilitate an exchange of cryptographic secrets. Initially, the British were hesitant. They were guarding the crown jewels of intelligence and were wary of American security protocols. But the deadlock broke when the Americans placed their own cards on the table. They revealed their success against the Japanese purple diplomatic cipher known as magic. They even brought a precious replica of the purple machine to demonstrate their good faith. Churchill gave the sign-off. The doors to the inner sanctum were thrown open. The Americans were shown the bomb, the electromechanical beast designed by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman to crack the Enigma. They were given the wiring diagrams and the operational procedures. Sinkoff later estimated that this briefing alone saved American codebreakers 2 years of development time. It was the greatest technology transfer in the history of intelligence, a gift that would eventually allow the U.S. Army and Navy to build their own fleets of decoding machines. However, possessing the machine was not the same as possessing the intelligence. Throughout 1942, as American troops began their buildup, the Allied intelligence picture went dark in the one theater that mattered most, the Atlantic. In a cruel twist of timing, just as the United States entered the war, the German Navy introduced a new four-rotor Enigma machine for their U-boat fleet. The British codebreakers called it Shark or Triton. It locked the Allies out. For 10 agonizing months, from February to December 1942, the Allies were effectively fighting blind at sea. This was the blackout. During this period, German U-boats, operating in what they called their happy times, slaughtered Allied shipping. They sank over 7 million tons of shipping in 1942 alone. The ability to reroute convoys away from wolf packs, a capability that had saved countless ships in 1941, was gone. This context is vital to understanding the tension Eisenhower faced. He was trying to build an invasion force while the supply lines sustaining that force were being severed by an enemy he could no longer see. It explains the skepticism of generals like Mark Clark. They weren't seeing the magic of British intelligence because, for most of 1942, the magic had stopped working in the Atlantic. They saw only sinking ships and a British ally pleading for patience. Eisenhower had to be taught how to use intelligence. Before the war, no senior American officer had experience with this level of high-grade signals intelligence. It wasn't just about knowing where the enemy was. It was about knowing what they intended to do, what their supply levels were, and what they were hiding. The British, despite their material weakness, were masters of this game. They used Ultra not just to win battles, but to manage the entire architecture of the war. They played a game of royal flush with no chips. They held the winning hand in intelligence, but lacked the military chips, the manpower and heavy weapons, to play it aggressively. Their goal was to convince the Americans, who had all the chips but a weaker hand, to play the game the British way. The first great test of this combined approach came in the deserts of North Africa. When Operation Torch launched in November 1942, it was messy. American forces, green and untested, made tactical errors. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, they were outmaneuvered and mauled by experienced German units. It was a humiliation, a harsh lesson that training manuals are not the same as combat. But the British were there to steady the line. Veterans of the Desert War, officers who had spent years chasing Rommel back and forth across the sand, provided the backbone that kept the campaign from collapsing. By May 1943, North Africa was won. Over 250,000 Axis prisoners were taken. It was the first major land victory of the alliance, a proof of concept that American industrial power and British operational experience could crush the German army. But the learning curve was steep, and nowhere was it steeper than in the air. General Karl Spaatz and General James Doolittle arrived to take command of the American air forces in Europe. Doolittle was already a legend for his daring raid on Tokyo, but the war in Europe was a different beast. He visited RAF Bomber Command and was sobered by the cold mathematics of the air war. The British night bombing campaign was grinding Germany down, but the cost was astronomical. Bomber Command was losing 5% of its aircraft on every mission. A crewman had a 30% chance of surviving a 30-mission tour. Doolittle met British pilots who were in their early 20s but had the eyes of old men. They joked about their odds with a fatalism that unsettled the Americans. They talked about friends who had vanished in balls of fire over Hamburg and Berlin. They described the flak that was so thick you could walk on it and the night fighters that stalked them in the dark. The RAF taught the Americans the unglamorous business of survival, how to navigate in a sky filled with enemies, how to hold formation when the plane next to you explodes, and how to wake up the next day and do it again. The American 8th Air Force, committed to daylight, precision bombing, initially suffered horrific losses. They learned, paid for in blood, that the B-17 Flying Fortress was not invulnerable. They adopted British innovations and eventually developed their own, but the initial tuition was paid by the RAF. Every procedure, every formation tactic, was a lesson written in the wreckage of British aircraft that had gone before them. As 1943 progressed, the intelligence war began to turn back in the Allies' favor. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park, aided by the capture of codebooks from U-boats and the deployment of new American bomb machines, broke back into the shark cipher. The lights came back on in the Atlantic. Suddenly, the convoys could be routed away from the wolf packs again. The hunter-killer groups could be directed to the precise coordinates of German submarines. The happy times were over. General Marshall, monitoring the flow of ultra-intercepts in Washington, began to see the wheat from the chaff. He realized that this intelligence was the key to victory. By March 1944, Marshall was actively writing to Eisenhower, emphasizing the supreme importance of ultra and setting the protocols for its use in the coming invasion of France. The skepticism of 1942 had vanished, replaced by a devout belief in the power of the intercept. The integration of command was finalized in the planning for D-Day. It was a unique structure, a fusion of national commands that has rarely been seen since. Eisenhower was the supreme commander, but his deputy was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, a Brit. The ground forces were commanded by Montgomery, a Brit. The naval forces by Admiral Ramsay, a Brit. The air forces by Lee Mallory, a Brit. It was a genuine partnership with American muscle and British brains intertwined at every level. This relationship was tested by personalities. Montgomery was cautious, methodical, and arrogant. He believed in setting the stage perfectly before striking. Patton was aggressive, reckless, and brilliant. He believed in violent motion. Eisenhower's genius lay not just in strategy, but in diplomacy. He managed these colossal egos, using Montgomery's caution to anchor the line and Patton's aggression to slash through it. By the time the invasion fleet assembled in June 1944, Britain had been at war for nearly 5 years. The country was exhausted. The national treasury was empty. The cities were scarred. But they had held the line. The American generals who had arrived 2 years earlier with doubts about British resolve now looked at their allies with profound respect. They realized that the fighting blind narrative was a myth. Britain had never been blind. They had been watching, waiting, and enduring, protecting the secret that would eventually allow the Allies to win. Eisenhower would later write a secret letter to the head of British intelligence, stating that the service provided by Bletchley Park was of priceless value to me and had saved countless British and American lives. He acknowledged that the speed with which the enemy was routed was due, in no small part, to the fact that the Allies knew their enemy's mind. The culmination of this partnership, the pluck of the British people, the industrial might of America, and the secret weapon of ultra, was revealed on the beaches of Normandy. But to understand the full scope of what happened when the Allies finally broke out of the beachheads, we must look at a specific incident that occurred just weeks after D-Day, an incident that revealed the other side of the equation. Not just what the Allies knew, but what the Germans were beginning to realize about the impossible enemy they were fighting. It was August 17th, 1944, near the town of Falaise in northern France. The air was thick with the smell of burnt cordite and rotting cattle. The German army was in full retreat, trapped in a pocket that was being hammered by artillery and air power. Amidst the chaos, a group of mechanics from the Wehrmacht's 276th Infantry Division stumbled upon an abandoned vehicle on a lonely roadside. It was an American truck, a GMC CCKW, known to the GIs as the Deuce and a Half. To the casual observer, it was just a truck. But to the German mechanics and the officers who would later examine it, this vehicle was a harbinger of doom. It was a messenger from Detroit that brought with it the mathematical certainty of German defeat. The mechanics approached the vehicle with caution. They were accustomed to their own equipment, machines of high engineering, precise tolerances, and complex maintenance requirements. They expected the American vehicle to be crude. They opened the hood and stared in silence. The engine was a simple six-cylinder commercial design. The parts were labeled in English. The spark plugs were accessible. The oil filter could be changed by hand. It was not a machine built for a master mechanic. It was a machine built for a farm boy. A senior non-commissioned officer, a Hauptfeldwebel with grease in the lines of his hands, flipped through the maintenance manual found in the glove box. He saw the cartoon-like illustrations, the step-by-step guides written in plain language. "This is not designed for idiots," he corrected his subordinate. "It is designed for an army of millions." As they probed deeper, the true horror of the situation began to dawn on them. The chassis plate identified the truck as coming from Pontiac Plant Number 1. The serial number indicated it was one of 150,000 built in 1943 alone. 150,000 from one plant in 1 year. The German mechanics did the math. In 1943, the entire German Reich, with all its conquered territories and slave labor, had produced approximately 100,000 trucks for all uses, military and civilian combined. The United States had produced 620,000 military trucks in the same period. This single American vehicle represented an industrial capacity that Germany could not comprehend, let alone match. The division pressed the captured truck into service. They loaded it with ammunition and fuel, overloading it far beyond its rated capacity. It didn't break. Its six-wheel drive system clawed through the mud that left the German two-wheel drive Opels spinning their tires. It was robust, forgiving, and brutally effective. It was good enough in a way that German perfectionism could never be. On August 25, 1944, the very same day the Allies officially launched the Red Ball Express, the 276th Infantry Division received orders to withdraw eastward toward the German border. As they prepared to move, they witnessed a sight that completed their education in the terrifying logistics of their enemy. On a parallel road, separated by a thin line of trees, an American convoy was moving up to the front. It was not a tactical movement of a combat unit, but a pure supply column, a river of steel flowing toward the battle. The watching Germans, men accustomed to their own sparse, often horse-drawn supply trains, stood in stunned silence. They began counting the vehicles as they rolled past. After 30 minutes, they stopped counting. The line was endless, truck after truck, stretching to the horizon in both directions, all identical, all loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations, moving with a mechanical precision that spoke of an inexhaustible source. A young soldier, barely 18 years old, watched the procession and asked a question that cut to the heart of the disparity. "Where are their horses?" The Hauptfeldwebel looked at the boy and realized the terrifying truth. The boy had never seen a fully motorized army before. In the Wehrmacht, despite the propaganda reels of panzer divisions, 80% of all logistical movement still relied on horses. 2/3 of their vehicles were pulled by animals. Their own division required over 5,000 horses simply to move its supplies and pull its artillery. Those horses needed food, water, rest, and veterinary care. They died by the thousands in the Russian winter. But the Americans had no horses. They had trucks. Thousands of trucks that could move hundreds of miles a day, never tired and never froze. That night, by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, the unit's supply officer ran the numbers. He calculated that a single American infantry division possessed approximately 2,000 trucks. With 40 divisions in France, that meant 80,000 trucks supporting combat operations alone. Germany, across all its fronts from Norway to Italy, had perhaps 100,000 trucks total. The Americans had almost as many trucks in one theater as Germany had in the entire war. The numbers were obscene. By September, the unit had captured 3 more GMC trucks and a Dodge WC-63, a smaller 3/4-ton utility vehicle. As the mechanics serviced this mixed fleet, they discovered something even more remarkable than the sheer numbers. The parts were interchangeable. A carburetor from a GMC fit the Dodge. Electrical components like starters and generators were standardized. Even the tires were the same size. The Americans had standardized their entire vehicle fleet, a deliberate pre-war doctrine established by the Quartermaster Corps to avoid the logistical chaos of World War I. The German officer realized the strategic implication immediately. One set of specifications, multiple manufacturers, he observed. It meant any mechanic could service any truck, any parts depot could supply any vehicle. In contrast, the Wehrmacht used vehicles from dozens of different manufacturers, a logistical nightmare where a mechanic trained on an Opel couldn't necessarily fix a Mercedes, and parts depots had to stock thousands of unique line items. Germany had designed its vehicles to be good. The Americans had designed theirs to be good enough, but in overwhelming numbers. This industrial avalanche was the hammer. But the Allies also wielded a scalpel, a deception capability that was just as sophisticated as their production lines. While the GMC trucks were conquering the logistics war, another unit was fighting a war of pure imagination. In March 1945, along the west bank of the Rhine River, German observers stared through their field glasses and saw their worst nightmare: an American army, 30,000 men strong, massing for a crossing. They saw the silhouettes of hundreds of Sherman tanks. They heard the clatter of treads and the roar of engines drifting across the water. They intercepted radio traffic from a headquarters coordinating a massive assault. In response, the German High Command frantically shifted their dwindling reserves, moving panzer divisions and artillery to meet this colossal threat. But the army they were preparing to fight didn't exist. The tanks were 93-pound rubber balloons, inflated with bicycle pumps. The artillery was made of wood and fabric. The deafening roar of the armored columns was a recording blasted from 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks. The army was actually the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known as the Ghost Army, a collection of 1,100 artists, designers, and sound engineers who were turning the European front into the world's most dangerous theater production. The concept of the Ghost Army was born from the British success at El Alamein, where General Montgomery had fooled Rommel with dummy tanks. American planners, specifically Colonel Billy Harris and Major Ralph Ingersoll, saw the potential to industrialize this deception. They didn't recruit infantrymen. They recruited from art schools and ad agencies. They found men like Bill Blass, who would later become a fashion icon, and Ellsworth Kelly, a future giant of minimalist painting. These men were tasked with creating the visual and auditory signature of a superpower. Their toolbox was a triad of illusion. First, the visual. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers used inflatable decoys to create dummy airfields and motor pools in hours. They understood that perfect camouflage was suspicious, so they would deliberately leave the corner of a rubber tank exposed, knowing a German pilot would spot it and believe he had found a hidden unit. Combat engineers would use bulldozers to carve fake tank tracks into the mud, adding the final touch of realism. Second, the 31st 32nd Signal Service Company used state-of-the-art wire recorders to play a vast library of sounds recorded at Fort Knox. They could mix the sounds of tanks, trucks, and bridge-building equipment to create a specific audio scenario. On a clear night, their speakers could project the sound of an armored division on the move for 15 miles, terrifying German defenders who couldn't see anything in the dark but could hear their doom approaching. Third, the radio, the signal company special, engaged in spoof radio. They knew German intelligence relied heavily on intercepting Allied traffic. The Ghost Army operators didn't just send fake messages, they mimicked the unique fist, the Morse code sending style, of the actual operators they were impersonating. When a real division moved out, the Ghost Army would take over its frequency, mimicking the rhythm and cadence of the real operators so perfectly that German listeners believed the unit was still there. Their masterpiece was Operation Viersen in March 1945. As the U.S. Ninth Army prepared to cross the Rhine, the Ghost Army set up 10 miles south of the real crossing point. They deployed 600 inflatable dummies and blasted the sounds of bridge building for 48 hours straight. The German High Command took the bait, moving their forces to counter the phantom threat. When the real crossing occurred, resistance was light, and casualties were remarkably low. This was the dual nature of the Allied victory. On one hand, the crushing weight of real American industry, represented by the endless columns of GMC trucks that never broke down. On the other, the sophisticated sleight of hand of British intelligence and American deception units, who could make the enemy see things that weren't there and hide things that were. The Germans were fighting a war against an enemy who could outproduce them by an order of magnitude and outthink them with invisible armies. But the final proof of this total dominance wasn't found on the land. It was found in the depths of the ocean, where the technological disparity between the Axis and the Allies reached its most lethal extreme. While the Ghost Army was fooling German generals on the Rhine, a silent slaughter was taking place in the Atlantic and the Pacific, driven by a technology so advanced it seemed like magic to those it killed. On June 23, 1944, in the mid-Atlantic, Commander Uno Kameo stood in the control room of the I-52, a massive Japanese cargo submarine. He was carrying 2 tons of gold and vital war materials to German-occupied France. He had just completed a rendezvous with a German U-boat. He felt safe. The night was dark, the ocean was vast, and he was running on the surface to recharge his batteries. He had no idea that he was already dead. Above him, an American Avenger torpedo bomber from the escort carrier USS Bogue was circling. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor, wasn't looking out his window. He was looking at his instruments. He had detected the I-52 on radar, a technology the Japanese submarine did not possess. As the submarine crash-dived to escape, Taylor didn't just drop depth charges blindly. He dropped a sonobuoy, a floating sonar device that transmitted underwater sounds back to the aircraft. For the first time in history, the pilot could hear the submarine moving underwater. He tracked the propeller noise. He waited, and then he dropped a Fido, a Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo. This weapon didn't need to be aimed. It listened for the sound of the enemy submarine and hunted it down autonomously. The wire recording from that night, preserved in the National Archives, captures the horrific sound of the I-52 being crushed by the ocean pressure as it sank, taking its crew and its gold to the bottom. The sinking of the I-52 was a microcosm of the entire war. The Axis powers, Germany and Japan, were fighting with courage, with skill, and often with superior individual weapons like the Tiger tank or the Zero fighter. But they were fighting an enemy that had fundamentally changed the rules of the game. The Allies weren't just winning battles, they were winning the war of systems. They had cracked the codes, industrialized the logistics, weaponized the deception, and mastered the physics of detection. Whether it was Churchill reading Hitler's mail, General Motors building a truck that couldn't be broken, artists creating phantom divisions on the Rhine, or acoustic torpedoes hunting submarines in the dark, the story was the same. The Axis was fighting a conventional war against an opponent who was waging a total, multi-dimensional war of information and industry. The German mechanic, looking at the GMC truck and the Japanese commander in the sinking I-52, shared the same final realization. They were not just beaten, they were obsolete.